Okay, guys, today we're going to go over FRQ writing, and I want to give a brief review before we get started of just the format of the test and what the test looks like. And of course, we got to give props to the memes. The APHG memes are the best. So let's get started. The first thing I want to discuss is the difference between the old format APHG exam and the exam updates for this year, which is 2020. The first and most obvious is going to be the time difference. In the old exam, you had 75 questions over the course of 1 hour. And with the new exam, you have 60 questions over the course of 1 hour. Both of them still have 50% of the exam score being multiple choice. But the difference is, and the reason why AP made the decision, or Human Geography Committee made the decision to lower it to 60 questions, is that they were going to be changing the type of question that they were going to be asking you. They were going to be much more in-depth questions, a lot more reading, paired or sets of questions that you were going to have to take a look at. And that just simply takes more time to read. So they took pity on you and they reduced, fairly so, they reduced the amount of time that you're going to, I'm sorry, the amount of questions that you're going to need to read for the exam, just because the new questions that they're going to be asking you will take more time to read. Now let's discuss the difference between the FRQs from previous AP exams and the new format. You're still going to have FRQs worth 50% of your grade, and this is what's really important for you to remember, is that half of your exam credit is going to come from the fact that you have to learn how to write these FRQs. But that shouldn't scare you. If you have a really great command of vocabulary, and I always drive this point home to my students that everything about this test is about your command of the vocabulary. It's not just memorizing the vocab, it's being able to apply the terminology. And like I tell my students, as we get towards the end of the year, you should be just living and breathing these vocabulary terms. When you're driving around, you should say, oh yeah, that's an example of distance decay, or yeah, I see that particular city pattern here, or look at that infrastructure over there. The vocab needs to become a part of you, and you cannot be successful in this class unless you have mastered vocab. And so that's why for my students, vocabulary is everything. We start every unit with vocab. I have a set of lists, vocab lists that they have to answer, that they have to write old-fashioned vocab cards, draw pictures or illustrations for some. And I tell them they need to be going over their vocabulary cards all the time, because once they have that vocabulary mastered, this course, I don't want to say it's easy, but it's doable. So in previous years, you tended to see FRQs. You didn't quite know how many points each FRQ was going to be worth. It varied, sometimes 5 points, 6, 7, 8. And I had to teach my students how to read for those points. Now AP has standardized it, which is awesome. And so now we know that each FRQ will now be worth 7 points. But it still helps to know where those points are coming from, which we're going to go ahead and go over in just a little bit. And I'll teach you how to read for where those points will be, or at least hypothesize where those points will be. And so when you're looking at the new structure, the old structure had you, you're analyzing and you're synthesizing and you're doing all those things. It's not that you're not going to be doing those types of things in the new FRQs. It's just it has it much more organized and broken down by type of question, which we'll look at in just a minute. Another thing that they've done, looking at the new rubrics, or I'm sorry, looking at the new directions here as far as the course description, is they're defining for you the types of questions that you're going to be getting, which once again is really great for you. So there's no kind of, oh, I'm not quite sure what's going to be on here, I have to predict what's going to be on here. They're telling you, which makes it easy for you to prepare. So the first type of FRQ will be one without any stimulus material, meaning it's just going to be words. And I'll show you some examples of that in just a minute. The next is where you're going to have some kind of information to be looking at, one quantitative and one qualitative. And of course, quantitative means that you've got data there, right? You have some kind of background information. These may be charts or tables, that kind of stuff. And then the third type of FRQ that they're going to have is going to be the same type of setup, but you're going to have two sources. So this may be a table of data, maybe comparing countries or charts, or whatever, maybe a chart and a graph, a map and a chart. But once again, this is not stuff that's not doable. This is all very doable, and we'll practice this throughout the course of the year. So this is just kind of a rehash of the same slide that I just went over, but I want to call your attention to this particular section that AP has put here in the CED, where it talks about two of the three free response questions assess students' abilities to analyze across geographic scales to explain spatial relationships. I know that sounds complicated or a bunch of gobbledygook. Pretty much what that means is that you are zooming in and zooming out. You are looking at something like, let's say, a table of a map of diseases, and you're looking at diseases across a country, and then maybe you might zoom in and say, okay, well, you have a high proportion of diseases here in this particular region, in this major metropolitan area, but maybe not in this particular region. Why would that be? Okay, so that would be comparing across or analyzing across multiple scales. That's the kind of stuff that you need to be doing. Sometimes there have been some previous FRQs where they talk about this with regards to voting patterns, that kind of thing. And so that's the kind of stuff that you'd be looking at here. Okay, so now down to brass tacks, as my dad would say, about what type of writing you're going to be doing. The very first thing that I tell my students is this is not what you're writing in your English classes, okay? In English classes, they care about your feelings, they care about, your thoughts about particular things. This is not that type of writing. I tell my students the first day we learn FRQ writing to write very big in their notes, I do not care how you feel. And that's a really important point with regards to this. You have to understand that as a reader, I cannot score your feelings, okay? So don't tell me how you feel about the fact that women in sub-Saharan African countries, how it makes you so angry, the fact that they can't own land. I get that, okay? I totally get it, but I can't score you on that. So please make sure that you don't put feelings, resist the temptation to proselytize or to write about things that you feel about. That's not going to earn you points. What you do have to do is use geographic concepts and always think about geography as you're writing here. What should your writing look like targeted towards what the CED tells you? Okay, those vocabulary terms that I come back to. And there is something to kind of think about here. AP is never trying to trick you. A lot of students get kind of upset. They're like, oh my gosh, I feel tricked by this FRQ. They're never trying to trick you. They want to see you be successful, but you have to know the vocabulary and you have to be able to give examples and applying those vocabulary to the FRQ that you're reading. This is why I tell my students that you do know the answer. Everything that I've taught you will be on this FRQ. But what we're really going for here, what are the underlying geographic concepts? And once again, this comes back to vocabulary, knowing examples, and being really solid in your knowledge of the class, because after all, you're earning college credit by taking this class and by taking this test, or you have the possibility to earn college credit. And AP wants to demonstrate that you've mastered that, okay? So before you begin writing, you need to be thinking about, okay, what is Mrs. Smart really asking me in this question? What am I looking for here? And that I'm not trying to trick you. And also make sure that you're giving current examples. When I start teaching my students, I always start with the FRQ that has to do with walls and other barriers. And I love using that FRQ because students always discuss Great Wall of China as an example. And of course, we know that Great Wall of China can't work as a wall or other barrier. Yes, it is a wall or other barrier, but it's not currently active. And the rule of thumb is always within the past 50 years. So make sure that you're giving examples. Really, basically everything since the end of World War II would work as far as examples are concerned. There are a few exceptions to this rule, a few, but it's because things that happened in the past, like let's say the Conference of Berlin, which carved up Africa, things that happened in the past are still having a strong impact on the current geography of a region. Okay, and also one more thing to kind of consider here, and especially those of you that are GT, this really applies to you. Always give the most obvious answer. Don't get all technical, and this is not the time to show your, super awesome knowledge of the Korean Peninsula. Give an example that every single student who's taken this class would know as a possible answer to a question. We're not trying to get like we're on Jeopardy here and know, really detailed information, because remember, your FRQ that you're writing on the day of this exam, they have not built the rubric yet. Okay, and so those you need to make sure that your answer is going to be something that someone in Singapore or someone in New York or someone in Florida or someone in Ecuador would be writing the same exact answer, because that's how the FRQ is built. Okay, next. Please make sure that your writing is concise. Okay, this is not the time to write pages and pages. Now, you will have tons of paper. Okay, the booklet, I don't know if it's going to be pink, but the pink normally booklet that they give you will have more paper than you could possibly use to write your FRQ. So you're not limited by page. Okay, I know a lot of you guys take, your English test or whatever, where you're limited by page, and that's not the case here. But you do need to be concise. You do need to get to the point. One of the things I tend to find with students when they write these FRQs is they ramble. And having a strong understanding of your vocabulary will prevent that, because you will know the terminology. This, of course, is also why planning becomes really important in your FRQ writing. Also, a couple of other things, vocabulary. I know I've said vocabulary probably 15 times during this recording, but vocabulary typically is where your points are located, okay? And so having a knowledge of that vocabulary and the application of those vocabulary terms with examples, that's how you get your points. Also, make sure that you're taking time to read the verbs that are in the FRQ. Verbs like identify. This is typically just a one-sentence response, okay? You have to identify the location on the map or identify a particular religion in a region. That you're only writing one sentence there for the most part. List would be kind of the same thing, okay? I've seen some kids and they'll actually just do bullet points. I don't recommend that. I never, ever recommend incomplete sentences here. Always write in a complete sentence. And quite frankly, it only takes you a couple of seconds longer to do it. So make sure that you're writing in complete sentences. Define is going to kind of be along the lines of identify, list, and list, because define verb prompts are going to be, once again, they're looking for you to be able to use a vocabulary term correctly, okay? And that's just a baseline understanding. Typically, these are going to be points that are earned that may be 1 or 2 points, really nothing more than that, because those are considered low-level skills. Explain and discuss verb prompts. These are going to be ones where you're going to have a bulk of your points, okay? And this requires much more writing. You're having to identify a concept and then apply it in your explaining process. Typically, that means you're giving some examples. And once again, you're giving examples of the concept that everybody else would know, okay? And that's why reading your textbook and using those resources that are given to you are important, because that's what helps you to complete the entire FRQ question. So a couple things with regards to when we're looking at outlines. I know kids get really freaked out when I use the term outline. So sometimes I just call it a brain dump. Just dump everything that is in your brain on a little planning section. Now, it cannot be on the section where you're actually writing, okay? But you can scribble stuff down right by the FRQ and just kind of dump everything that's in your brain for the first 5 minutes or so to get yourself organized. And students tend to resist this, but once they learn the value of this, they tend to not want to go back to not outlining it. And the reason why is this. It's that outlines will help you to remember what you want to say, okay? It gives you a road path, because for a lot of kids, you're going to spend the first few minutes of that FRQ freaking out. You're going to be a little nervous, a lot nervous, and you've got to allow yourself some time to just calm down. And so what outlines do is it empowers you to be able to get some thoughts on paper, and then you're like, okay, I know some of this at least. I might not get all of the points, but at least I'll get some of the points. So when we're looking at the stimulus material that I referenced earlier, it could be anything. And I went ahead and pulled 2 separate maps. I pulled, this is a map that was used in an article discussing where they found the likelihood of where they might have found Osama bin Laden. But it's a great example of a couple different concepts here. It's a great example of distance decay. It's a great example of, you could say, almost a functional region. You have a particular region here, right? South Asia that we're looking at. You have a particular map projection that we're looking at, and a smooth map projection. So there's a lot of different things that you could grab from this particular item, right? When we look at the AT&T coverage map, first of all, it's a choropleth map. Functional regions we have here, these are good examples of infrastructure because our cell phone technology is infrastructure. So there's a lot of different items that you can grab from this particular one as well, okay? And that's what you need to be doing when you see that stimulus material on the FRQ, when you get to it, that's your brain dump. You're just kind of brainstorming all the terms that you could think of that could apply to this particular FRQ. And you really need to do that before you even look at the words on the actual FRQ. Just take a look at the images to get your brain revved up and ready to go. Okay, so one thing to kind of think about here, and I probably should have written this differently, not how you earn your grade, but how you get your score. You need to know that your FRQ is scored and not graded. So points are added and not taken away. You don't start at a 7 and then you deduct points for answers that are wrong. You earn points for things that are correct. Okay, so you basically start at 0 points and points are added from there. So that's also something to think about in this process. Okay, so I want to kind of leave you with one more thought about vocab. I know I talk about vocab all the time, but because this is a rubric based scoring, meaning after you write your FRQ, they're all shipped and they're sent up to Cincinnati, where we go to read them. The rubric is made after you take the test, and so that's why it's important that you have really good mastery of vocabulary. And so I put I wanted to give you an example of what happens when you don't know vocabulary. This is an example of a machine that some of you might know really, really well, given the climate that you live, and some of you might not know what this is. But if I were to give you vocabulary terms surrounding this particular machine, you could write about it. But if you don't know the vocabulary terms surrounding this machine, you wouldn't be able to write about it, okay? And that's how you have to think of this AP class. Is vocabulary is everything. It's not the only thing, but you can't really do anything else well in this class until you've mastered the vocabulary, and then you can move on to those higher level skills like application, which is where you see the points in the FRQ. So that's it for this particular session on going over the basics of FRQs. I'll spend some more time going over particular FRQs. We'll pull those apart and we'll take a look at those next time. Bye-bye.